Good morning, everyone. So we're going to start today's conference with this panel on how perception is shaped. So as social scientists, we all understand that human perception is imperfect and it's also very malleable, that it's influenced by both proximate contexts as well as those that are much more distant and layered. It's influenced by interpersonal interactions as well as institutional structures, as well as by our internal states, our internal cognitive and emotional states. This panel will give us just a taste. It will be a very rich taste, but it will be just a taste of the type of social science research that is examining our perceptions, our understanding of ourselves and of our world, and also of the forces that shape these perceptions and understandings. We are going to go in the order listed on the program. I'm going to ask you all to save your questions, take notes, and save questions till after all the presentations are completed, because we've reserved a good amount of time for both questions but also cross-disciplinary discussion. So save your questions. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. So our first presenter is Amber Boydstun. She is Associate Professor of Political Science here at UC Davis. Amber's research focuses on the distribution of what we all know is a very, very scarce resource, and that is attention, human attention. She studies the causes, dynamics, and political effects of media attention and media framing. Amber?
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. On behalf of the other presenters, I just want to say how excited we are about this institute and how grateful we are to the campus for funding it, and to Dean Mengen for leading it, and to the executive committee for shepherding it, and especially to Joe and to Vicki and to Lauren for making everything happen. This is really exciting. It's amazing. It's fantastic. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Amber Boydstun. I'm an assistant, soon-to-be associate, thanks, for political science, and thank you. And I want to talk today about a book that I recently published that's on media storms, which I define as those instances when a news item gets a sudden increase in attention to a very high level and then is sustained over weeks or months. Let's start by talking about Attorney General Eric Holder. This man has a hard job. I would not want his job, soon to be inherited by Loretta Lynch. This is a very hard job, not for lots of reasons, not the least of which is that over the last 9 months or so, he's had to face an onslaught of public criticism about a string of incidents in which unarmed black men were shot and killed by police forces. This is a problem that I'm sure you've heard about in the news. Just for example, in July of last year on Staten Island, 43-year-old Eric Garner, unarmed, died from a chokehold put on him while being put under arrest. In August, in Ferguson, Missouri, 18-year-old Michael Brown, unarmed, was shot and killed during an altercation with police. In November, in Cleveland, Ohio, 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed for brandishing what turned out to be a toy gun. In April, just earlier this month, Eric Harris was unarmed, 44-year-old, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was pinned to the ground by police and then shot to death when a volunteer deputy mistook his own gun for a taser. And just 2 days later, Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, 50 years old, unarmed, was pulled over for a non-functioning brake light, tried to run away, and was shot in the back. These incidents have produced an outcry of public frustration and questioning, as we can see in this snapshot of all of America's tweets over 2014. So here are our tweets. 185 million in total. And you can see here by the spikes that the amount of Twitter coverage of the Ferguson shooting, the Ferguson grand jury, it outnumbered the Ebola crisis, it outnumbered Election Day, the Hobby Lobby decision, and of course, Russia invading Crimea. We have been talking about this issue a lot. And we've been talking about it in a particular way. We've been talking about it as a crisis. This tweet is just one example. We cannot stand for this. This is murder. This is a national crisis. God, I am angry. We're thinking of it as a new crisis, but in fact, it is not. This policy problem has been around for a long time. Since 2000, in fact, there have been nearly 6,000 fatal encounters with police officers, of which more than 2/3 were non-whites. These numbers are pretty stable over time. And this is a complicated policy problem that involves a lot of different considerations, one of which is the humane and fair treatment of subjects, and the other is the safety of our police officers. But the point is that it's not a new policy problem. What is new in the last 9 months? The media attention. There's been a surge of media attention. And this media storm, as I call it, it matters. And it matters because it's produced protest after protest, after protest, after protest, after protest, after Harvard medical student die in protest. Media storms affect our perception of reality. They tell us what to think about, and in many cases, they tell us how to think about those things. We can think of a lot of other examples of media storms. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, Hurricane Katrina, the case of the legal battle about whether or not to remove the feeding tube from Terri Schiavo, the missing Malaysian airline still missing from last year, the Catholic priest abuse scandal. In each of these cases, we were told by a media storm to think and to think hard about these policy issues, even if the policy problem itself had been going on for a long time. What I want to talk about today are why media storms happen, where do they come from, what journalistic features produce them in the first place, and then really in what way exactly do they matter. As a social scientist, there are so many different ways that I could go about answering these questions. And for the first question, why media storms happen in the first place, I turned to a number of different tools, but mostly to qualitative research. I did a bunch of digging into how news happens over time. I drilled down into the archives, but mostly I did interviews. I went to the journalists and the editors themselves at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I asked them, I said, how is it that you decide to follow one story and not another? How is it that you decide to follow a story over time or to change and follow a new story? How do these media storms happen? And from that discussion, I want to talk to you briefly today about news values and how they shape the news, but also these important dynamic patterns of coverage, the patterns through which journalists seek out stories or shift to a new story. From that discussion, in this book, I offer a new model of the news generation process that I think helps us to better understand where these media storms come from. And to see whether media storms matter or exactly in what way they matter beyond this anecdotal evidence that we've just talked about, I'm going to point us to two important empirical patterns that exist in the news. And the first one is that because of the nature of media storms and the journalistic features that produce them, news coverage is explosive. It doesn't change gradually in real-time responsiveness to real-world events. Rather, it moves in fits and starts. It fluctuates between rapid overhaul and then fixation. And that has big implications for how we see the world. And the second pattern is that because of that explosive nature of change in the news, we see a dramatically skewed view of which policy topics matter. A few policy issues will get the lion's share of media attention, and most issues won't get any attention at all. Let's start then by talking about how media storms happen, and let me just give you a quick primer on news values. News values are those traits that a news item holds that help journalists and editors decide whether or not to pay attention to it in the first place. You've heard the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. That's true, and if it's more sensational, it'll get more coverage, and also if it's more proximate to readers, if it is in our backyard, we're going to pay a lot more attention to it. Just for example, I want to show you on this graph the amount of US news coverage towards 3 different natural disasters. And for each one, I'm going to map how much news coverage there was for the disaster from the disaster itself at day 0 through the weeks that followed. 3 disasters we're going to look at: the Haitian earthquake, 230,000 fatalities, the Indian Ocean tsunami, 350,000 fatalities, and Hurricane Katrina, which was atrocious and terrible, but many fewer fatalities, objectively a much smaller natural disaster. Here's how the US news responded to the Haitian earthquake. It got attention, and then it dropped fairly quickly off the radar. Same thing for the Indian Ocean tsunami. Here's Hurricane Katrina. And no one would argue, especially those in the New Orleans area, that it got too much coverage. In fact, they'd say that the news outlets, they departed too quickly. But the point is that we pay more attention, much more attention to something that affects us at home. So news values matter, but the dynamic nature of the news coverage matters as well. Above and beyond deciding which stories to follow based on how much readers are going to pay attention to them, how is it that news outlets go about seeking a story and deciding how long to follow it and then when to switch to a new story? That's really what I wanted to look at. And in order to think about this, I'm going to present 3 different models, 2 models that we've considered already in communications and political science, and then a model that I'm going to propose instead. And the discussion really, I think, hinges here on our normative views of what we want the media to be like. These normative views, of course, influenced by our traditional views of Watergate-type coverage, Woodward and Bernstein, and those types of watchdog outlets that we want to have in place. So that's our first model, thinking of news outlets as watchdogs. And under this model, media acts as sentinels. They survey politics and society, they go down every back alley, they look for problems to report on, and anytime there's anything that we need to know about it, they tell us. They do so through in-depth investigative journalism, and that means that we can just hang back and lead our lives and wait for the media to tell us about a problem. That would be great. That's, of course, not how it works. And so a second model was proposed a couple decades ago. And in this model, we might think of media more as alarm responders. Under this model, they can't have the resources to go down every back alley. So instead, news outlets have to hold back and wait for a metaphorical alarm to get pulled, maybe in the form of a major event, a natural disaster, a political gaffe, or maybe a whistleblower. An alarm gets pulled somehow, and news outlets look at the news values of that item and then go and respond to it, but they do it in just a brief fashion, and then they drop it like a hot potato and move to the next alarm. What that means is that we would, under this model, get mostly surface-level reporting, which is a super disturbing idea, that news outlets would only be giving us this surface-level reporting and that we would never get further under the surface. We'd never hold with a story long enough to really unpack it. Both of these models, I think, have something to say, but I argue that each one is only telling us half the story. If we want to know how the news actually works in reality, then we need to have a model that integrates both of these perspectives. The model I present in this book is called the hybrid model, and the idea here is that problems happen in the world and alarms get pulled in that same way, and news outlets with scarce resources, they respond to alarms. But in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, those same journalistic incentives that drove news outlets to cover those alarm items in the first place, they drive news outlets to shift into watchdog mode. And when they're in watchdog mode, they give us in-depth reporting in that neighborhood. Maybe it's a geographical neighborhood, like New Orleans with Katrina, or like Afghanistan with the war, or maybe it's a policy neighborhood, like healthcare with the Affordable Care Act. Wherever they are, when they're in that neighborhood, they go into this watchdog mode, and they send us back much deeper level stories. So then we can think of news coverage as falling into this 2x2 table, where a bunch of the time you'll see news stories that are just one-off human interest stories or a single crime event. And sometimes you'll see stories that are produced by this watchdog type reporting, but without any of that sudden alarm responsiveness. So when you see coverage of general weather patterns like storms or the Pope's visit, New York City's war on crime, it might be a high level of coverage, but it's not sudden. It doesn't capture our attention because of its novelty. By contrast, we see stories that are only produced by this alarm mode without any watchdog follow-up. And these are stories like the Haitian earthquake, like Michael Jackson's death. There was a lot of stories, but only for a short period and only at a surface level type of reporting. The type of stories I'm most interested in are when these two modes of reporting intersect. And these are the media storms: 9/11, the baseball doping scandal, the Catholic priest abuse scandal, Ferguson. We're in the midst of a media storm right now on the heels of Ferguson with the question of deadly force by police. And these media storms, again, are interesting from a journalistic point of view, but the reason I'm most interested in them is that of these 4 different types of reporting that we can get, these are the ones I think, and empirically we've been able to show, that are really going to influence politics, public opinion, society, policy, in ways that the other types of reporting just don't have the reach to do. Let's talk about that in more detail. Media storms matter. I've given you some anecdotes. But in particular, this hybrid model that I've suggested, it implies 2 empirical patterns that we can test. And the first empirical pattern is that media coverage is not going to change gradually over time. Instead, as news outlets shift between this alarm mode and this watchdog mode, they're going to lurch between periods of abrupt, rapid change and overhaul and then periods of fixation. And we can test that notion empirically. The second pattern that is suggested by this model is that coverage is going to be dramatically skewed across topics. And we might expect that just by learning about news values, just by knowing that we care more about things that are going to affect readers than we do about things that are not going to affect readers. But this particular hybrid model that I've suggested is implying an even tighter degree of skew. And that's because when news outlets go into that watchdog mode in those neighborhoods, they're going to be giving us, in many cases, really great in-depth investigative coverage. But they're only going to be doing it in that neighborhood, which means we're going to get a disproportionate amount of coverage about those areas at the neglect of a bunch of other important policy problems. Let's test these ideas. I'm going to look first at the New York Times front page. This is a particular kind of news animal. It's the New York Times. It's a broadsheet newspaper. It's the front page. I'm going to talk later about how these findings apply to across different types of media, but I will tell you that studies have shown that even in the modern media landscape, the New York Times is a surprisingly accurate snapshot of what the larger US media is attending to. It's very representative. I'm going to look over an 11-year time period at all of the front page stories from the New York Times, every single one, 31,000 stories in total. And for each one, I've categorized it according to what the main topic was about, using a categorization system of 19 different topics: macroeconomics, civil rights, health, etc. Additionally, each story is coded according to a more fine-grained subtopic, using a coding scheme of more than 200 different categories. Let's think then about media attention as a scarce resource, as an incredibly scarce and important resource. If we're going to divide this resource over our 19 policy categories that I've coded for, what would it look like? If each policy area has equal representation in this media agenda, it would look like this. But in fact, of course, that's not what it looks like. It looks like this. Which policy issues are getting the bulk of attention? Well, here it is again, but with the labels. The New York Times pays the most attention to international affairs, to defense, to government operations. Education, I am sorry to say, is way over there. And agriculture, I am equally sorry to say, in California, we know how important agriculture is. It's that tiny little green sliver right up there. It's just not sexy enough for the news. We can look at the same exact data, but in a bar chart here, and we can see that this is really dramatic skew. A few topics are getting the bulk of attention. Remember I said that I also coded these stories according to the subtopic at a finer grained level? This story is even more dramatic. Just a couple policy issues get the lion's share of attention, and most really have to struggle for any attention at all. Okay, so news coverage is skewed. Is it explosive in this way that I've told you? Let's take a look at a year in the life of the front page of the New York Times. I'm going to walk you through 12 months, starting in April of 2001. And of course, in 2001, in September, we're going to have the 9/11 attacks. So here's April, a typical month. May, not a lot of change. June, not a lot of change. July, not a lot of change. August. Here's September. The 9/11 attacks here are under defense because they attacked our homeland security, and international affairs then starts to respond as we send troops into Afghanistan. Here's November. Here's December. But then look what happens in January. In January, the Enron scandal pushed even 9/11 off the agenda. And in February, we had the Winter Olympics, which always gets covered. So when we look at this graph over time, we can see this quintessential media storm in action, where on the y-axis here we have 100% of the media agenda. And so every time then you see one of these colored lines reach out and then come back in, that's a moment where we had a huge sudden increase in media attention over at least a month or more. And in the media world, a month of coverage is a tremendously long period of time. Zooming out, we can see even more clearly the series of media storms. We had a media storm in 2000 in government operations surrounding the Hanging Chad debacle, and then a media storm after 9/11, that's the first green one, and then another one when we deployed troops to Iraq. Zooming out even further, you can see the same thing. So are these findings unique to the New York Times? Well, probably not. We would expect that they're not, and we'd expect that they're not because these patterns of skew and explosiveness, they're driven in large part by marketplace competition. And marketplace competition is going to be even more fierce among TV outlets and especially online. We can test this. I have a massive data set. I looked at policy issues across 15 national newspapers and state newspapers, 5 TV outlets, 7,000 online sites and blogs, all the ones that you would normally expect, more than 1 million different stories altogether. I have a measure of explosiveness that I'm not going to talk about now, but it's a good measure of explosiveness. And when we look at this measure of explosiveness, what this tells us is the degree to which each of these news outlets, New York Times, national papers, local TV, online news, the degree to which each of them is moving over time in this particular way, where it'll surge to cover something, but then fixate, and then surge and fixate. That particular type of dynamic movement. Here's the New York Times. Let's compare it first to national and local newspapers. So it's pretty much on par. But here's TV news. It's even more explosive than broadsheet newspapers. And here's online news. This is exactly what we should expect. Let's look at Skew. It's a great measure. Here's our measure of Skew for the New York Times, national and local newspapers, and TV and online news. The point here is that these twin properties of media coverage, that it will be explosive in this way, moving in fits and starts, and that it will be dramatically skewed across policy topics. This is a nature not of the New York Times or of newspaper coverage. This is a property of our media in the US and media worldwide. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by talking about the good news and the bad news. My co-author, Allison Ledgerwood, will tell us in the next session how you shouldn't lead with the bad news, but I'm going to. The bad news here is that for most issues, most of the time, it's really hard to get on the agenda. That means if you're someone who cares deeply about a policy issue, if you're a policy advocate, then you're going to have to wait for the political and event stars to align to get media coverage. It also means these patterns of skew and explosiveness mean that we get a radically disproportionate view of what's happening in the world. We see a radically skewed view of how many policy problems are out there actively at any given point in time, and we get misleading signals about how quickly these policy problems resolve themselves. This is tough for us as citizens to figure out what's really happening out there in the world. It constrains our views of reality. It also makes it really hard for people like Eric Holder to make any kind of meaningful response in a policy realm to these signals when he's having to try to keep up with public perceptions of reality as filtered to us through the media. And I want to just point out that none of the journalists or editors with whom I've talked, and no one I know, wants these patterns to exist in the news. These patterns of explosiveness and skew across issues, these patterns happen despite really good journalism. They're hardwired into the news by virtue of our institutional incentives and by virtue of us, by what we click on, by virtue of what we pay attention to. Here's the good news then. The good news is that these media storms that happen because of this model, this hybrid model of news coverage, these media storms can have a powerful impact on public perceptions. If news coverage operated in a more moderated way, where it just raised and lowered gradually in response to real-world problems, we might not catch notice of things in the way that we do in response to a media storm. Let's look just, for example, at the Catholic priest abuse scandal. This scandal broke in 2002 by the Boston Globe, and this scandal was huge, it was uproarious, and what's most interesting, I think, from a policy perspective is that all of the alleged abuse victims from the half century before the abuse scandal broke, everybody back to 1950, of all of those abuse victims, 1/3 of them came out in 2002 after the story broke, suggesting that there was something about that type of media coverage that destigmatized the victimhood. Let's look at Terry Schiavo. This was the legal discussion about the feeding tube removal. After the Terry Schiavo case, the number of Americans who had living wills increased 4-fold. And if we look at the use of deadly force, already since this discussion started back in July of last year, the U.S. Senate has called for a set of hearings on the use of body cameras on police officers, and there are now 85 different pieces of legislation about body camera police use across 30 different states. Finally, as media consumers, we really do hold the power. If we want to enhance our view of the world, then we can change the channel. There's an entire world of news coverage out there on a multitude of diverse news websites that you can find if you go search for it. And if we go search for that news, then we'll be sending signals to news outlets that they can give us a more diverse set of coverage. That's it, and if you want more information, here is my book. Thanks.